It's so appropriate that this meeting is being held in the context of the university hospitals, because they're pretty fundamental to what I'm going to be talking about. And it's also pretty important that the papers that you're going to hear today are talking about the developments, the changes in teaching and learning and so on that you have got involved in over the past year. And I'll be asking really, so where do we go to now? What I have to say is, I wondered about this, but what I have to say is really relatively brief. And because I wasn't quite sure what angle would be interesting to people. So it's relatively brief, and I'm really hoping that we'll have a very good conversation about this, and that when I'm not clear, as I'm sure I won't be, you'll ask me what on earth I mean, and you'll put in all of your views and your experiences and your aspirations for where we do go from here. And I really look forward to that conversation. So this is all about distributed and distance learning. And the standards that I and a very small team of people have written about this for an organization called the World Federation for Medical Education. That is an organization that has produced standards for undergraduate medical education, postgraduate. In fact, we're just rewriting those, CPD, master's degrees in medical education. And in response to huge demand, we've now written standards for distributed and distance learning, and those will be available within the next couple of weeks. So I'll just be meandering around all of the issues or some of the issues, the big issues in distributed and distance learning, and what the World Federation for Medical Education has set up as a structure for this. Obviously, the reason why this is, well, maybe not obviously, but one reason why this is interesting at the moment, and why I'm getting lots and lots of invitations to talk about this all over the world. I'm going to Taiwan after you, is because over the past year, people have made huge changes in what they're doing. And those changes kind of look a bit like distance learning, maybe, or maybe they don't. So I hope we'll think about all of these things. As far as I'm concerned, as Dr. Gerling said, I'm an educational psychologist. I've actually never done anything except work in medical education since 1972, before medical education was even a thing. I've got a lot to do with distance learning, because for 35 years, while I was still doing policy research for the government on medical education and for the GMC and medical royal colleges, I was at the Open University because they were the only ones who were gracious and perhaps foresighted enough to say, well, okay, here's this strange woman who does this thing called medical education, and nobody knew what it was. Most people thought it was health education, probably. She seems to be doing something that's different and interesting. So as long as she learns how to do distance learning, we'll take her on. And the joy of the Open University in those days was really unbounded, because they would allow people to do new and different things. So I spent 35 years in that distance learning environment, although for all those 35 years, I was just doing policy research in medical education. So I myself have run a big international distance learning master's degree. We've got students from 45 different countries. So I've actually been involved in doing distance learning, not only there, but in lots of other courses in the Open University and in India and in Bangladesh. So I've done a lot of this distance learning stuff. One thing that I think is important and interesting is that while I was at the Open University, we were invited to look at the possibility of setting up, this was during one of the expansions, an entire distance learning medical school. And so a team of us at the OU, working with 11 different medical schools, I honestly can't remember if Nottingham was one of them, but I imagine it probably was, but they ranged from, you know, Imperial to East Anglia or wherever. So we planned an entire distance learning medical school. And it was wonderful, absolutely brilliant. You can do it. And the government wanted this because if a medical school is distance learning, you don't have to build the buildings and everything. You can expand numbers, you can decrease numbers. So for workforce planning, it was a great idea. I actually think it was a great idea anyway, despite the workforce planning issue. We planned that, and our plans were accepted by the Chief Medical Officer, by the General Medical Council, by what was then the Department of Health. So they all said, yep, you can do that. Unfortunately, the Open University decided not to do this. That was probably the worst decision it ever made. So we don't have a distance learning medical school, but we really could have. And looking at what has happened over the past year, it would have been a wonderful thing. However, you know, the plans are still there. Because of what's happened over the past year, as I said, we've been asked so many times, and because of our experience in distributed and distance learning, to write some standards for that. So that is what we have done. And I'll tell you about those a bit later on. So very often when people think about distance and distributed learning, and I'll talk about the difference between those two in a minute, but when people think about that, they immediately think that it's all about technology, that it's all about online something or another's. Well, it isn't. Distance learning is not about online. It's something else. And online, although you have, and I've been absolutely amazed at how people have turned around and produced all this stuff in the past year. It's been so impressive. But you've been doing this for years. It's made schools focus on technology-based teaching methods when your students were sent away from you. But you've been doing this for years. There've always been internet, well, not always, but for a long time, there've been internet library resources and other internet resources. People have been running virtual lectures and seminars and tutorials. I mean, students inside their own campuses have not gone to lectures, but have looked at the lectures afterwards, sitting on their beds and getting as much benefit probably as sitting in the lecture theatre. There have been simulations, and you're going to hear a lot about that today, obviously, for a long time, and very sophisticated too. And some of those are technology-based as well as the actual practical ones. There have been videos for a long time. There have been learning packages for a long time. I can remember in the 70s, learning packages that were about audio, tape and slide. Can you imagine? When I came into this, you were using audio, tape and slide presentations. That is a form of technology. So lots of learning packages and web-based things and all sorts of stuff, lots of demonstrations, and then the inevitable self-assessments, which are normally just mind-numbingly boring. And all those yours, I'm sure, are wonderful. And all sorts of virtual reality, which comes in as being very, very expensive. So it's all there. You've done a lot of these things. You've got experience in a lot of these things. It's the focus and the amount of it and the exclusivity that has changed over the past year. So you've got a good grounding, a good basis in all of this. But, and this really is my central point, these are all just teaching methods. They are just teaching methods in the same way as a lecture. or a seminar or a ward round or anything else is a teaching method. They are just teaching methods. And that means they all offer you options. So I keep on being asked to talk about this at the moment because people seem to think or wonder whether or not this whole COVID experience of the past year is actually going to revolutionize medical education. My answer is, as you see here, I really hope not. I really hope that a response to a crisis does not become the new status quo. And I'll tell you why. Because current medical education has huge, or previous medical education has huge strengths, and teachers have had huge skills in teaching in all sorts of ways. Curriculum committees, educational managers, massive amounts of really great experience and really good practice, in my opinion. So previously, medical education had a lot of strengths. Of course, medical education wasn't perfect, but name me an education system that is perfect. It's a social science. That means that if you get it right for today in this group, it'll be wrong for tomorrow and another group. That is the nature of social science, that there is no settling down to what is right because the society around you changes. So there are strengths, there are weaknesses, and when there have been weaknesses, people have addressed them. And also, I wouldn't want medical education to be revolutionized because it has necessary content. In basic science, in clinical skills, in assessment, in experience, it's got those things. And although you might say, well, we can revolutionize the way we deal with them, I'd say, please don't. And also, I don't think that this past year's experience of having all over the world, of having to teach and keep engaging students who are no longer necessarily with you, means the same thing to everybody. Because medical schools, whether it's within this country or in different countries, if you compare yourselves with a medical school in Southeast Asia or South America or anywhere, in Taiwan, where I'm just going, metaphorically, virtually, medical schools differ. They differ according to their mission, what they want to do. I can't stand that word actually, but what they want to do, their context, their problems, and that requires contextual development. You have to do what's right for you, not what seems to be the thing. You know, medical education is not a fashion statement. And very often, medical education seems to be treated as a fashion statement. Oh, we're doing that too. No. So development should occur in response to an identified problem, not in relation to fashion and not in relation to whatever some forced experience might be. So development has to occur in relation to what is needed and in relation to solving a problem. And even if medical education was going to change, there's no robust evidence to suggest what innovations to adopt. So it's wonderful to look at your program today when you're all reflecting on your experience of different types of teaching and learning and method and what happened and what you learned from doing that. And that to me is a fantastic basis for making those wider curriculum decisions. So whenever I've been in Nottingham, I've always found exactly that your whole approach to things is so rational, is so based in practice. And that's exactly how it should be. So rational development, not some change, not some revolution, is really what's required. So what changes have happened? Well, in many places, students are no longer located centrally in the medical school. They'll be coming back, but in a different way, and they are back in a different way. There's been conversion of curriculum elements to virtual or technology-based methods, but a lot of that was happening already. And I can see from your program that you were doing a lot of that already. But what has happened in a lot of places, not necessarily with you, but all over the world, and we've just got a paper coming out about this, which I could send to you actually, is this conversion and delivery model. So students suddenly were sent away from the medical school. They were all over the place. And so medical schools said, right, we've got to convert what we do to something that we can send out to them. And that's what a lot of schools around the world actually did. And that was amazing to see. It was appropriate as a short-term firefighting response to a crisis. But that's what it was appropriate to. Just that. And schools didn't usually, quite understandably, because who on earth had time to do anything? Not only were you doing this, you were also dealing with this pandemic. Schools didn't usually change anything other than method in teaching and sometimes in assessment. So there was this firefighting conversion and delivery response, and I am so impressed by the technical development of teachers and schools. But I'm a bit worried that this new experience with technology-based teaching actually may become embedded without any further refinement, that this might seem to be a good way of doing things forever. So I'm a bit worried about that. So if schools do decide, and I'm pretty sure you won't, but if schools do decide to change their identity in the long term to a more technology-based, perhaps, process, if they're going to do that, or if they see that students who are distributed, and we'll be coming on to that, students who are distributed actually is the way it always is in medical schools, which is why it's so good that we're here talking in the university hospitals. So if they see that and simply have the firefighting response of changing everything to some technology-based process, that's not going to be enough. If there is a new perception of what we do with these distributed students, or you want to distribute them even more, as the Open University Distributed Medical School have done, we mapped services in the entire NHS and said we could put students here and here and here and here in groups, distributing them everywhere. So if you're going to think about it in those ways, then you need a different planning, implementation, and quality assurance process. So changing that perspective on the way in which you see the distribution of students and learning and experience means that you actually have to change your perspective on what the Central Medical School does and how it does it. And that means that if that balance changes, you need to, or schools need to adapt their planning, their design, their resource allocation, and their management to distributed learning, to seeing your school as a place not where students are centrally located, but as a place where students are distributed all over the place. So, or I imagine what, and I rather hope that what will happen will be that you will see both, that you have students centrally and you will go back to that model, and then that they scatter through different locations for clinical learning and so on. But that part of it is perhaps the part of it that needs a bit of consideration on the basis of your last year's experience. So I'm going to be talking about the extreme case here, and you'll have to take from it the bits that are appropriate to you. I'm certainly not advocating that you go into some extreme form of distributed and distance learning. But where you have that, the school itself needs to change, not just to adjust its teaching methods. And the school has to change, although you do this already. But in many places, the school has to have an actual local presence. Appoint teachers who are near the location of students. You do that already. Set up regional branch offices if they're a long way away, which they're not going to be that far from you, probably, although I don't know, for meetings, for study, for academic advisors, and so on. So those issues about not only the students being distributed, but the teachers being distributed, the management responsibility of the school being distributed, and the support the school offers for teachers and students who are distributed is a really important, shall we say, mindset when you start to think about how to support students who are at a distance from your campus. That might not suit all schools. And a lot of schools will simply revert to their previous formats, and I'm very happy with that. But when they do, I hope that this past year's experience has enabled people to think differently about the students who are not on the campus. So what's distributed learning? Just to get round to that. It's where students in whatever institution are away from the central management entity that institution is. So in the Open University, they're everywhere, for example. And you can do that in a medical school as well. And that means that the school has to extend itself to where the students are. So the school then, as you already do, or as the school already does, incorporates facilities and staff near to where the students are to deliver the curriculum. That is a nicely managed process. So you not only see students as being distributed, the school is distributed as well. And learners, as you do, are supported by central and local teaching staff. Importantly, if this is a distributed school, it's not only the students who need support, it's the teaching staff who need support, and maybe even local managers who need support. So it's all of those functions of the school which become distributed. And then within that, you will have a rich variety, which you're demonstrating today, of virtual, technology-based and face-to-face teaching. Lots of actual face-to-face stuff. So you distribute the face-to-face function as well out to wherever the students are, but you do that anyway. And the learning methods, the assessments and so on all become distributed. And that's just a different way of thinking about and managing and designing what you do already. So distributed learning has to be a managed whole systems approach, and seeing the school and all of its locations as part of that whole system. So you have that anyway in distributed medical education. You're doing it. You've got the central medical school with all of its staff and academics and researchers and everything else, curriculum design, all that stuff. Then you've got hospitals, like all the trust, the university hospital trust that we're talking at here. You've got all of those people. That's part of the distributed school. Maybe local study centres. If your students are a long way away, you probably don't have those, but that would be really nice for your students who are in groups in other places. And then community and rural facilities, which you probably use in general practice in primary care, maybe social services, I don't know. But in a lot of places, there is a lot of dependency on community and rural facilities as well. And these are all part of the distributed school. It isn't handing over your students to them. It's all being part of that whole system. So the World Federation has set all of this out as a set of standards for distributed and distance learning. These standards have taken a lot of writing. I think I read over 100 papers when I was doing this. We consulted with about 150 people around the world and so on. So it's taken a lot of development work. a lot of expertise too. The assessment piece was written by John Norsini. So we have written these standards, which you might be interested to read when they're out, and they'll be on the WFME website, and you can use the bits that you want to use and don't use the bits that you don't want to use. And they set out the conditions for distributed learning. So I no longer say distance learning, because distance learning seems to be this center throwing things out to people in the periphery. These people are at a distance from the center, but they're not at a distance from the center. They are distributed. They are where they are. They're not at a distance from anything. And if they feel that they are, then that needs a bit of remanaging. So it sets out the conditions for distributed learning that's effective for teaching, for learning, for the curriculum, that is a long-term development, may be properly implemented, well managed, and quality assured. And that takes a slightly different approach. They were written, as I've said, by people who've got a lot of experience of distributed and distance learning, as well as expertise in, for example, assessment and management and so on. We consulted, as I've told you, really widely on this. And eventually it'll be supported by workshops and training and consultancy and whatever else people need, because there's clearly a lot more to it than you can write in a set of standards. So the standards are pretty comprehensive. They're principles based. They're not prescriptive. They don't say you've got to do this and this and this. They say think about this, how are you going to do it? They set out the design areas and the issues within them so that you can decide what's right for you. What's right for Nottingham is not going to be right for, I don't know, Dakar or somewhere. And it has key questions and guidance to enable schools or regulators to consider the application to their own context and then to quality assure that. So we hope there's a whole little system in there that enables people to make their own design decisions and then to think about how well that's working. So in distance learning, in distributed learning, there are rules, you know. And rule number 1 is forget everything you ever knew about fashions in independent, self-directed adult learning. You do know, I assume, that adult learning isn't really a thing. There's no difference between adults and children. None. My favorite bugbear, please don't talk to an educational psychologist about adult learning, because they'll go, what? So forget everything that you knew about that. Distance and distributed learning actually is about keeping a hold of those students, of helping them through a pathway, of making sure that they don't get lost and fall by the wayside, which they can so easily do, that they feel supported all the time. It's not about setting them loose in a sea of opportunity that they will never be able to navigate. So forget everything you knew about that. And if you think you're being over-directive, you're doing it right. Distance and distributed learning succeed when you take the student through a defined learning pathway and keep them there. I know that sounds wrong according to all the fashions in medical education, but it's right in terms of learning. And that means it has to be a carefully managed whole process. These are the things which the WFME standards deal with. They deal with the character of, or they don't deal with, they talk about in the introduction, the character of distributed and distance learning. And then we've got standards for course design, for course production, for assessment, for student support, for the support of academic and clinical staff. And then really importantly, for management and for quality assurance. And the standards in each of these set out the principle that should probably be attained, and then ask questions. How are you going to do this? So all of those areas are there in our standards. And I hope that those standards will be quite useful. And I'll be very interested to hear what people think about them. So I hope that the conclusion from the past year isn't that there has to be a revolution in education and everything's going to suddenly turn into these new methods. I hope that the conclusion is that you have learned a lot, as I can see from this day's papers, that you have learned so much in terms of refining the ways in which you do these things. And that is brilliant, because then that gives you a really solid basis from which to choose how to deliver parts of the curriculum. But just changing those delivery methods isn't enough. If schools decide to stay with distributed learning, and some of them around the world are intending to, then it needs whole systems management. It needs effective use of distributed locations and effective quality management and support for those locations. And that means support and development, not coming and judging them, but supporting and developing them. Students need support. Teachers need support, whether they're the ones in the middle who are developing all this stuff, or whether they're the ones in the distributed locations who are teaching. And it needs quality assurance, and it needs academic management. And we've spent a lot of time talking about academic management in our standards. So how's this different from traditional learning? The students, the school, the facilities, the clinical learning and resources are distributed. Yours are from time to time anyway. So for you, it's just about thinking about those things differently and perhaps seeing that differently. It involves central planning, management, and quality assurance of the distributed system. You are undoubtedly doing that already. So it's a different kind of mindset. A different balance, perhaps, of technology, face-to-face and group learning, maybe. A different balance, maybe, of formative and summative assessment, maybe more formative, less summative. There's no evidence that masses of summative assessment makes a lot of difference. Greater support for teachers, greater support for students. Don't leave them alone saying they're self-directed learners. And a central role for academic management and for records, which is part of it. And finally, some advice that just comes from my experience. You don't have to take it. Don't change unless you first identify the problem and plan an appropriate path to address it. I can see you're doing so much of this successfully already, so you're on that path. Education, as I said, is not a fashion statement. Always put in evaluation to track the effects of whatever you've changed. There's no evidence base to help you decide what changes to make. Never assume that students are natural online learners. They are not. They might be good at actually pressing the buttons, using the technology, swiping the screens. That is quite different from using technology for learning. Being able to play games and navigate systems is not the same as using those for learning. And do use traditional and new educational methods. Never give up your traditional ones. And finally, support and management in relation to every aspect and every person are really, really important. So that's all I have to say. And I hope that you've got things to say too, although during the day you're going to be saying an awful lot that's relevant to this.
Hi Janet, thank you very much indeed. That was fantastic. I think some of the things you've said have really resonated with us in terms of kind of almost throwing the baby out with the bathwater in some ways. And we've heard of things that we've called COVID keepers. And I think that looking through at the things that have worked really well and the things that have, as you say, been almost thrown together as a response to the kind of firefighting that's required is a really important part of it. One of the things we found has worked really well is that the medical students have been allowed to been designated as key workers, which has meant that we've been able to establish them much more in the way that our nursing students are, in terms of being part of the teams, which was something that medical students had moved away from a lot. So that's been helpful. But as you say, that automatic assumption that students like to learn online is actually something we found is not the case, and we found lots of people really unkeen. in terms of that aspect of it, I guess the bit that worries me most is around the sort of well-being of having students doing hours and hours of online learning on their own, away from, you know, sort of their friends and colleagues. What experience have you had of that in terms of the impact that online learning can have in kind of isolating people a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, no matter how many bells and whistles you put in, learning online can be pretty boring and pretty tedious, and you just don't want to carry on doing it. I remember talking to some students here in London who just said it hurts your eyes and the quality of feedback's really appalling, which is absolutely right. So I think that as this short-term firefighting response, you had to do that. What you have found is what you have just said, which is that just doesn't work. You wouldn't make students sit in one type of teaching method all day long, no matter what, whatever it is, you wouldn't do that. And there's no logic to doing this online. So what I would say is that part of the management responsibility of a school is to see how you can get students together, how you, even in these times, you can get students together, you can get students together with teachers, you can vary the teaching and learning methods, you cannot keep swamping them with stuff on screens. You did that because you had to do that. But if in future you want to change and develop your curriculum, that absolutely has to stop. And the use of technology has to be something which is one thing in a range of things. So my answer to your question is actually, if you swamp them with permanent technology, there is nothing you can do to stop alienating them. Just as no matter how good a lecturer is, if it's all you get all day, they're not going to want to be there anymore because the seat gets uncomfortable. So I would say that for future thinking, you have to produce the same rich experience as you have in the past, and that there's hardly anything you can do to make online learning palatable if it goes on for too long. You simply can't. It's a very limited, I know it can show you lots of stuff. It's a very limited medium. Those endless MCQs and questions and I mean, it's always the same. It's soul destroying. So I just say, vary it as much as you can, get them together, get them talking, map where they are, map who they can talk with locally, and this kind of thing. Which is obviously, it's a big design process, it's a big centrally managed process, but in terms of design, there's hardly anything you can do to mitigate the effects that you're talking about if you swamp them with this single mind-numbing thing. And then the technology goes wrong.
Yes, absolutely. And I think our challenge is that the university is moving to having kind of almost 2 days a week of online learning, and then we're having the students for 3 days a week, which is something we're kind of having to not battle against, but certainly question, because I think, as you say, that is hard work for students, and they don't get necessarily the same out of it.
Do you mean 2 days, 2 full days, like Monday and Tuesday are online and Wednesday, Thursday? Oh dear.
Yes, exactly. So I think there may be a bit of flexibility about it, but it's something that we're kind of sort of working with at the moment to try and think about whether that's going to work for them. So
well, you'll find out. I mean, which is why you have to put in the evaluation and the quality assurance. And you've already told me what you know, and that's not going to change. It really isn't going to change.
Thank you very much, Dr. Grant, for a very interesting and challenging talk, because I think you raised some very interesting dilemmas. I think one of the problems with online is that the old codgers of us think that the only way to remain current is to be into new technology. And in fact, that is complete rubbish, isn't it? As you've said.
Yeah, total rubbish. Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think we often get carried away about the structure of how we deliver teaching and forget it's actually the core of what we're trying to teach that's important. And as Louise has said, we are having, and it is a battle with the medical school, who were so proud of the online urgent delivery that was achieved when the pandemic hit, that of course they want to keep it. And when you then talk to the medical students who said, well, compared to nothing, it was probably all right, but let's not pretend it's good. And it seems to be that the online teachers are much greater enthusiasts of it than actually the participants. I'm zoomed out. I hate the blasted things because, you know, actually we make relationships. Medicine is all about relationships with patients, with colleagues. And I mean, dare I say it, before this, we were getting into the realms of where we don't do it for real. So simulation. And that's become a massive mantra that actually makes us all pretend. And Zoom is and the online stuff is a further development of that sort of thought. But I think I was really encouraged that I like some of the concepts of it actually being out of completely the sort of familiarity that we're used to. And actually, I think we've not probably scratched the surface, have we?
I agree with every word, support every word that you say. I love that phrase that you just used about we are forced to pretend. And, you know, being forced to pretend when you can do it for real sounds not a very wise thing. And medicine is an interpersonal thing. So, yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. But whenever I talk about this, everybody's experience is the same. And it seems to me that this kind of fashion is something that will, in the end, be overtaken by the evidence and probably by student achievement as well. And what we've often found when people put in these new things is that students will go through these, whatever new system it is, and then they'll go back and in parallel, they're learning the old ways. So it's difficult if you're looking at, you know, researching this to see what effect the one and the other has. But I really worry, just as a completely separate issue, I really don't have anything to add to what you've said because I agree with everything, but I really worry that changing a curriculum is actually an ethical issue. You wouldn't change a treatment, you wouldn't change anything in your professional areas without going through, you wouldn't do research without going through some ethical, some recognized process. When it comes to medical education, they just change everything. Let's throw out this curriculum, have a new one, and then 10 years later, look at PBL or something. Oh, that doesn't work. In the meanwhile, you've subjected these students to something which proved in the end to be actually unethical in terms of their education. That really worries me. So I think that we need I'd love to see, I say this everywhere I go, an education ethics committee in every school before you decide how to change. So yeah, I mean, I support everything that you say.
Hi, my name is Rosie Arnott. I'm one of the teaching fellows here at NUH. I was just thinking about the learning environment, because obviously if you're doing distance learning or distributed learning, then trying to manage the learning environment the students are actually involved in. So within our department, there's two of us in the elderly care department, one of whom's had to shield, so been at home, and I've been the only one based in the hospital, and actually having that face-to-face experience and that clinical contact has made such a difference, particularly in the elderly care department. We've been so hit by COVID and having to have those sort of corridor conversations, I guess, particularly with wards where maybe they've been very reticent, particularly during the pandemic. So how do you manage that? And I'm sure it's a very long-winded answer around if you're doing distributed learning and you're sort of all in different places, I guess.
Yeah, well, all I can say is that you actually do start to manage it as it is anyway, because you do have students who are located all over the place. So you need to, I just think, how do we do that? How do we do that effectively? And you will have lots of ways of doing that effectively. And what doesn't work so well. But for me, I mean, I'm just a very old school person who likes to do things systematically. And at the center of education, as far as I'm concerned, is management, not all this other, you know, teaching and learning stuff about which we know nothing, but is management. So there's management and there's analysis. Now, you're worried about the environment. So all I can say to you is if I was sitting with you, I would say, okay, so what do you want to achieve in that environment? And what are the conditions of that environment? What are the challenges of that environment? And how do we solve that problem? And this to me is a management issue. It's about how you manage groups of people who are, and they are in groups normally, however small that group is, in one place. How do you manage them? How do you support them? How do you help them to develop that environment that you want to see? Obviously, there's the whole clinical environment thing. There's all sorts of things. There's the clinical environment, the learning environment, ideas about teaching, there are the resources, there are all sorts of things. But to me, that is simply about an analysis and a view about the qualities that you want to see and how you manage that into place. You know, you can't have an answer to a question. I can't say to you, this is what you do, unless I've gone through that, you know, which is why as often as not, what happens is that I will go and look at I don't want to come and look at it, but I will go and look at places and say, okay, and take people through that thinking. It's all about analysis, aspiration, management, and then you look at resources and all these other things as well. So my answer to your question is I don't know, but I do know the processes that you should go through in order to solve that problem and find the answer for yourself. What are the actual problems that really worry you?
There aren't any, I mean, our departments work very well. It's just obviously if you're in a distributed learning environment that you're describing, you might not have that mechanism, or you might not have those people on the ground, I'm thinking, in quite the same way if you're working in different places. So our department's fine, and actually we've worked really well through COVID. But if we had been in, if it hadn't been as coordinated, then maybe it wouldn't have done. So it was just how you would manage that if you're more distributed and you know you don't have a central point in the same way that we've been able to have.
Yeah, and that is a big issue. But what it means is that again, I can't say there's one answer that I can give you, but I do know that when I've set up distance learning in other places in medicine and so on, and in writing these standards and in doing all sorts of other work, that local management is really important. That having somebody who has local responsibility. So you devolve that management responsibility. You can devolve it to areas, you can devolve it to locations, you can devolve it to institutions, you can devolve it in whatever way is responsible to you. But you have to devolve and distribute the management function. And the manager, and you know, that'll be a clinician doing that. It won't be a manager. So it might be, but you know, it depends how sympathetic they are. But you have to devolve that as well. It isn't that the medical school can sit centrally and say what should happen elsewhere. It's that wherever the elsewhere is, has somebody who is the person whose responsibility, or one of whose responsibilities, is management, support, quality assurance, feeding back to you what's needed and what works and what doesn't. So that has to be how it's done, and that actually is how any distance learning organization does it. Any effective one, they distribute not only the students, but they distribute the management. So, you know, the Open University, for example, which is a rather dramatic and extreme example, you know, we've got regional offices. So those regional offices know what's going on in their particular area. You have to do the same. And you can do it. I mean, it's, you know, it's just boring systematic management.
So I'm in quite an interesting position at the moment, in the sense that I spend some of my time working clinically at NUH, but I am also working on curriculum development at the medical school. So I'm kind of seeing it from both sides, and I'm hearing lots of different perspectives. And it wasn't that many years ago that I was at medical school myself. So one of the things I just wanted to roll back to the kind of the online learning side of things. And I think I think back to when I was at medical school, and some of my experiences were great, and you know, being on placement and actually seeing patients and so on. But I also remember certain sites where I would go on placement and I would be you know, at the hospital, but essentially what I would be doing would be I would be sat down in a seminar room or a small teaching room, and a clinical teaching fellow would essentially just be lecturing to me all day anyway. And you think, well, what was the point of me going all the way out to X site, which I'm not going to name, and just sitting down and learning in the same way as I would have?
Yeah.
And so in some ways I can really see an impetus for distance learning and for online learning, because it saves a lot of those kind of logistical hurdles of getting places to not really do anything different. And I think one of the things that we're hoping to achieve from perhaps retaining some of the elements of online learning going forward is that we can free up those placement days to truly be that proper core clinical placement stuff. We're going out, we're going to clinic, we're going to theatre, we're seeing patients, and kind of avoiding clinical placement time being lost to some of that more didactic sit down in the room teaching. I think there is a recognition, certainly from medical school, that the online provision for the last year was very much, as you say, it was firefighting. The provision was poor. We're talking a lot of text-only PowerPoints, no narration, no interactivity, no small group learning, very few webinars. And it was very much just, sit down, go and do it. And that has been a necessity in the sense that it's something that's been cobbled together at short notice because of the pandemic, but it's certainly not something that would be a good idea or a good experience going forward. I guess my question, if there is one, is do you think that by bringing in things like, so some of the things that we're planning on doing going forward is getting students to be in perhaps a small group system where 5 or 6 students who are learning at a distance will come together and they'll talk through some issues, perhaps facilitated by a member of staff, some larger group webinars which are led by an attachment lead who will then kind of direct students through their teaching and talk about cases, reflections, and so on. Do you think that some of these things can help to mitigate against some of what you've talked about in terms of the dangers of or the pitfalls of online learning? Or do you think that it's just kind of a no starter from the get-go?
No, I absolutely do think that would help. I think that getting people together where they are and meeting, talking about things is pretty fundamental to learning. It's pretty fundamental to teaching. And, people just like to talk with one another. So I think that's really good. To me, this is all about delivering a rich and varied curriculum. And it's fine, even one PowerPoint that's just all words, people can tolerate that if it's only one and it doesn't go on for very long, because that's, fairly concentrated, right? I can get that over and done with. But it's the density of all this that's the problem. Learning is a very varied thing. People need to learn in different ways for different things. People like to have variation. So I think what you're suggesting is a really good idea. You need to put on top of that your whole quality assurance stuff. I mean, things that we've done in the past is to, for example, where teaching is distributed out into, and places where I've worked, say in mission hospitals all over the place, what we've done is to send people from the centre out there to actually, I mean, it might not be possible here, to actually work and so on, so that we mixed people from the centre and in these peripheral places. I shouldn't say peripheral, but those distributed places, but also provided support for teachers there, for example, in terms of exercises, in terms of lots of resources for them to use during these groups, so they don't just sit there and lecture. So they go, oh, we've got a great exercise here, try this, try that. And I think you just have to keep on trying to see what works, because what will work in one place won't work in another. And in one culture things work, and in another culture things don't. So I think that you just need to vary it, to realize that you've got to vary face-to-face personal interaction and whatever else it takes to deliver your curriculum. If you're doing that, and what you're saying is you are doing that, and you manage it and you quality assure it and you support it, that'll be as good as it gets. It won't be perfect. You'll evaluate it. People will complain about this, that, and the other. You'll change it. And then the next time they will complain about not having the thing that you've taken away. But that's just the nature of it. I think that sounds like you're taking a really good approach.
Yeah, no, thank you. I really, really appreciate your input on that. I think what you said about density is a really interesting point, because, looking through it, what I found going through medicine in particular was we had a weird situation where we had 3 online resources on idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis that all covered one tiny learning objective, which was mainly a postgraduate topic anyway. And yet we only had single PowerPoint on pneumonia, which only covered
dear.
about half of our learning objectives, and it was just bare bones. So, and I think it is just a historical, it's just what we had laying about from various clinicians' hard drives when the pandemic hit, just got hung up on a virtual learning environment, just so that there was something there. And that, you know, obviously that doesn't work going forward.
No, it had to happen at the time, but
yeah,
you've learned from it.
Yeah, so we're keen to build on that, and yeah, those 2 of those IPF lectures have gone. So I
think, you know, what everyone's saying here is so important. What you've all said, reflecting on your, I don't like that word, but still reflecting on your own experience, that is your best guide to what to do. Because, you know, education's a social science. That means there's no evidence to tell you what to do. But your own experience will tell you what to do in the context of, you know, the conditions in which you're trying to teach and learn, in the context of the ways in which your students are and where they are, and all sorts of different things, the resources that you've got. But what you've said, all of you have said, is just so important, and it just rings absolutely true with me, because it's what everybody says. So listen to yourselves.
Lovely, thank you. So I guess the message is that break up those online stuff with all the other sort of modes of learning.
Yeah, that was really helpful. I was going to pick up on one of the areas you raised that Ian also mentioned about relationships, student relationships, and what you asked about was pastoral support. I know with the dispersed learning environment, you end up with medical students especially having to move across geographically dispersed sites as well. And often they don't get opportunity to build up peer relationships, let alone support with teachers. How do you optimize their pastoral support?
That is quite a common issue and a common question, and I think that's really, really difficult. I mean, pastoral support is really difficult when they're all in the one place and you've got an ongoing relationship. But what all I can say is that unless you know who's available when and where, it's difficult to say. If you've got local organisation, then you should have local mentors and people to whom students can actually turn if they wish, but very often they don't. And certainly in say the Open University, we have always done that. There are people locally who will provide that support. So you have to think about the extent to which you can distribute that. But the point that you make about students moving around and not even being able to build relationships with one another is also another problem. And it's a problem that has to have a solution, not an acceptance. Because you know that what medical students in particular do seem to form very tight groups and very tight friendships that seem to me to be permanent. And that's something that you need to be aware of, and you need to support. What I would do is 2 things. I mean, I don't know what the answer is. I'm just telling you what I would do in order to try to find an answer. One thing I would do is to ask them, ask students what they would like when they're feeling awful and they want advice about anything big or small, whether it's just confusion or whether it's just feeling I can't stand any more of this. Ask them what they would like. I can remember having conversations I remember a conversation I had in Khartoum with a group of students. Exactly that. People would say, we want to set up pastoral support and we'll do this. And I just said to the students, well, what would you like? And they said amazingly, well, what's there is fine, but we want a door that we can go through without anybody seeing us. And it's things like that you would never, ever have thought of. So first of all, ask them. Secondly, what works in our master's course, which has students from all around the world with all sorts of problems, is actually one person who happens to be our academic manager centrally, who is always there, who creates a personal relationship with 150 students, who is known, who is open to any question, who will answer all the time. So there is always just one friendly person. And in most places, there is that person. It isn't a matter of being over elaborate about something special. It's just a friendly person who can actually either solve problems or move those problems. So I would do those two things. I would have a central friend, and with us it's our academic manager, who just actually has gone on holiday for 3 days, yesterday, today and tomorrow, and has never gone on holiday before because he's always there. And we had this, I was amazed, we have a WhatsApp group with all these hundreds of students, and all these messages came in saying, you really deserve time off, you're always there for us, and enjoy the sunshine and all of that. That to me was the best evaluation of that personal support. So I would do that and I would ask them.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Just with that first point about asking students, I know the challenge we had was sometimes students, the most vociferous students, are often telling you what they want. And the universities then turn around and say, well, actually, what they need is different. And again, it's trying to sort of adjudicate in that quality management. But that's been really helpful. Thank you for that answer.
Thank you very much indeed. Dr. Grant, thank you again for a really thought-provoking session for us. I think everybody has learned a lot from it and really enjoyed it. So I really thank you for giving up your time.
Thank you so much. You're going to have a great day, I'm sure. And from the conversations that we've had, I think your students are going to have a great time as well. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.